How was your day today? John DCQR reporting from somewhere in Toronto, Canada. Today I'm going to continue with a series called The Babboonery of Wall Street and Its Real Intentions. I am going to give a commentary on two articles written by Brian Montopoli, so let's get started. His first article I'm going to do a commentary is called Occupy Wall Street, More Popular Than You Think, and it was published on October 13th, 2011 at 3:35 p.m. So let's get started. The conservative criticism of the Occupy Wall Street movement is that it is a growing mob House Majority Leader Eric Cantor of shiftless protesters, the Tea Party expressed, engaged in class warfare, GOP presidential candidate Herman Cain, whose grievances, whatever they are far outside the political mainstream. Of course, the so-called conservatives are going to set up some dialectic concerning class warfare, which is non-existent. They are a mob of shiftless protesters, but they are a mob that is bought and paid for by the establishment. The polls don't back that up. Wow. Heavily slanted polls with loaded questions always tell the truth. Yeah, right. I put the link of the survey in the description box. A new survey out from Time magazine found that 54% of Americans have a favorable impression of the protests, while just 23% have a negative impression. An NBC Wall Street Journal survey, meanwhile, found that 37% of respondents tend to support the movement, while only 18% tend to oppose it. This is coming from a magazine long known to be a CIA mouthpiece, whose founder was a Knight of Malta and a British MI6 operative with major corporate interests. This further shows that Occupy Wall Street is supported by corporations. The findings suggest that the right's portrait of the movement as a collection of lazy hippies who need to stop whining, to take a shower and get a job isn't resonating with most Americans. Why would or should anyone listen to an agent of the Jesuit-run Tavistock Institute? While Bill O'Reilly wants to give an impression that Occupy Wall Street is a spontaneous grassroots movement, I agree with Bill O'Reilly that people do need to take responsibility for their own lives and not depend on the experts. That's because while the protesters' aims are vague, Bill Clinton said Wednesday that they need to start advocating specific political goals. Note the amplification. Their frustrations are easily identifiable and widely shared. The Occupy movement may be a big tent, one with room for opposition of fracking, calls for campaign finance reform, and a host of other positions, but nearly everyone involved says they are angry that a small group of wealthy Americans have grown increasingly rich, while the other 99% have been left behind. So Rockefeller relative Slick Willie and Jackson Stevens' crony endorses the movement as well. By the way, Jackson Stevens is also a business partner of Papa George Bush's many business ventures. Being angry of a small group of wealthy Americans, let's face it, Occupy Wall Street is just another shakedown operation based on the original Robin Hood story. Rob from the undeserving rich to give to the deserving rich. Continuing. That's a belief that seems to be shared by Americans across the political spectrum. In 2010, a CBSNews.com reported in a story on the income and wealth divide last month, researchers from Harvard and Duke asked Americans how they thought wealth is spread among income groups, as well as how they thought it should be spread. Overwhelmingly, Americans said they wanted a more equitable distribution of wealth. They also underestimated just how large the wealth divide has grown. Remember, believing in something does not make it true. But it's great for occultation, but that's a topic for another discussion. As the study's authors noted, all groups, even the wealthiest respondents, desired a more equal distribution of wealth than what they estimated the current United States level to be. Republicans, Democrats, Independents, as well as rich, middle class, and poor all said wealth shouldn't be concentrated among the highest earners. Remember what I said about Robin Hood, it's pivotal. That goes a long way towards explaining the Occupy movement's potential staying power and cultural resonance. While most Americans wouldn't camp out in the freewheeling quasi-society that has sprung up in lower Manhattan, a vast majority seem to share the protesters' sense that the economic deck is stanced. Remember, they've seen the government bail out the banks and help create the economic crisis, seen corporate profits hit all-time high after all-time high, seen CEO pay balloon to 350 times that of the average worker. Where do they come up with these statistics? They've seen average hourly earnings adjusted for inflation stagnant for a half a century, while CEO pay increased 300% since 1990. They've seen social mobility decline and friends and neighbors join the ranks of long-term unemployed, while the wealthiest Americans have had their tax burden reduced and increased their share of the nation's wealth. For details behind these statistics, see the extraordinary valuable graphics put together by Business Insider. Yeah, that's in the, I'll put the link in the description box for your interest. Further showing that big business supports Occupy Wall Street. Why are people so unwilling to admit that Occupy Wall Street is a shakedown operation? By the way, CEOs take more risks and put their reputations on the line. If a worker makes a mistake, he merely loses his job. If a CEO makes a mistake, he loses the company, and he is the one that has to deal with angry investors and shareholders when the company loses money. There's no denying that some of the protesters fit critics' characterization of the many, though certainly not all of the most committed demonstrators are the sort of outspoken young leftists that O'Reilly seems to disdain. More dialectical nonsense, and there's no question there's a wide variety of opinions about how to move forward, both within the movement and the public at large. But the polls and data suggest that the protesters' underlying concerns resonate widely. Occupy Wall Street may have an uncertain future. Demonstrators in New York may be de facto evicted Friday morning. Jeez. What? Well, when someone says evicted, it implies that they didn't pay the rent for a few months. But moving on. But it clearly seems to have tapped into a widespread sense that the economic system is out of whack. No, the economic system is fine. It's the people that are out of whack. And that makes it far more difficult for critics to blithely dismiss the protesters as outside the American mainstream. Remove the irritating credit-consuming spoiled brats, I say, but that is not going to happen, for the shakedown is not yet complete. And now I'm going to go on to the second article, Left Behind in America, Who's to Blame for the Wealth Divide? And this article is published on September 7, 2011 by Brian Montopoli. Take a moment and think about how you feel wealth should ideally be spread among the American people. Here's a suggestion. Stop taking people's hard-earned money regardless of how wealthy or poor they are. If you're like the average respondent in a 2010 Harvard Business School Duke University study, your response was this: the richest top 20% of society as determined by net worth, should control 32% of the wealth. The bottom 20% should control about 10%, while the rest should be spread out among the 60% in the middle with higher earnings taking a slightly larger share. That respondent borrowed money for their education. They should have read the fine print that they had to pay back the loan plus interest. Besides, who would answer a university? Who else would answer a university survey? Certainly not the ones who are busy creating wealth. Regretfully, I was foolish enough to go to university for a few years, but I worked hard during the summer to pay for tuition. Realizing I was wasting time and money, I dropped out. When I was going to university, I had to deal with people who had a perverted sense of entitlement, being the welfare bums that they are, and having no consideration for parents having to work to keep the party and brats enrolled. These people also have the most blatant audacity to complain about how corrupt the system is. In Canada, for example, roughly 80% of Canadians never go to university, but have to pay for the 20% that do. I am sorry, but the university system is undemocratic in every sense of the word. And these condescending hypocrites constantly harp on a lack of democracy in the world, but I digress now. Where the hell was I? Continuing with the article. It probably won't surprise you to hear that those figures don't match reality, but you might well be shocked by just how far off they are. In the study, Americans were asked how they thought wealth was actually distributed. They estimated that 20% controlled about 50% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom controlled about 3%. That wasn't even close. In reality, the top 20% controlled about 84% of the wealth, while the bottom quintile controlled just about 0.01%. The combined net worth of the bottom 40% in fact accounted for just 0.3% of the nation's wealth. See the chart? Yep. One indicator of where you fall in the spectrum is race. I'll start again. One indicator where you fall on the spectrum is race. White households on average had a median wealth of $113,149 in 2009, 20 times the median wealth of black households, and 18 times that of Hispanic households. That's the largest gap between whites and minorities since the census started tracking data in 1984. It's not just wealth. In 2007, U.S. income equality hit its highest mark since just ahead of the Great Depression in 1929. And that was before the current recession brought joblessness and financial peril to scores of Americans, most of whom were on the wrong side of the wealth divide. While statistics are deceiving, the question that needs to be asked is, why the fuck are white people complaining that their privileges are taken away? Seriously, most of the protesters were spoiled, debt-ridden white people, and most of them are being driven to fascism without any of them knowing of it. But moving on with the article. According to the CIA's World Factbook, the United States now ranks 39th in the world when it comes to income inequality. What that means is that only 38 out of 136 countries have a less equitable distribution of income than the United States. The list of countries with a more equitable income distribution include Iran, Russia, Turkmenistan, and Yemen. The CIA has sympathy over Occupy Wall Street. Damn, the world's coming to an end. So praise the Lord and everyone else burn in hell. Of course I'm being facetious. Continuing. The financial gap is widening as economist Joseph Stiglitz documented in Vanity Fair in May. The top 1% of Americans have gone from taking 12% of the nation's wealth 25 years ago to taking nearly a quarter today. Over the past decade, income of the top 1% has risen 18%. The income of Americans in the middle, meanwhile, has fallen, further showing that corporations and other international institutions support Occupy Wall Street, which is now going global. Read the article on your own time. Links are in the description box. And consider this as a 2009, according to PolitiFact, the net worth of the nation's 400 wealthiest Americans was higher than the net worth of the bottom 50% of the nation's household. We have this growing elite that makes the economy of the United States look like a banana republic than an economic democracy, said Democratic Representative Jan Schakowsky of Illinois. Oh, great. Now America's hit squad, the Mossad, supports Occupy Wall Street as well. Yes, Michael Moore has connections to the Mossad as well as other agencies and vested interests. Oh, and there was a bunch of nasty people in those protests that wanted to blame it all on the Jewish bankers. I'll talk about more of that in another series. There isn't a one-sentence explanation for why America's wealth gap is wider than Americans say they want it to be and why it is growing ever wider. But a good place to start is with the decisions made by elected officials, many of whom are themselves in the top 1%. That's because the top 1% take the most risk. Get a clue, morons. Why is Congress a millionaires club? Yeah, it is, but so what? People are still stupid enough to elect them in the first place. Those decisions tend to follow the desires of the affluent. In his 2008 book Unequal Democracy, Vanderbilt political scientist Larry Bartels looked at how the senators responded to the preferences of their constituents, to the preferences of those in the upper third income distributions, less responsive to those in the middle third, and not at all responsive to the preferences of constituents in the bottom third of the income distribution. Obviously, people who are responsible for wealth creation, take risks, should have a say in government. Duh! In other words, the data suggests that if you're in the bottom third in terms of income, it really doesn't matter what you think. Your senator effectively doesn't care. Senators are not legally required or morally obligated to care for anyone's sorry ass, i.e. irresponsible people. A bias towards the desires of the wealthiest Americans has resulted in policies that critics say exacerbate the wealth and income divide. I wonder who those critics are. But moving on. Among them, reduced capital gains tax rates, deregulation of the financial system, and a reduction of tax rates on high earners. They say many politicians largely serve the wealthy and leave those on the bottom behind, pointing out that the minimum wage is currently lower than it was 30 years ago after accounting for inflation. Yes, people have to realize that wealth redistribution schemes do not benefit the poor in any way or hurt the rich. But moving on. The growing wealth gap is not an accident or a force of nature. It's clearly the result of public policy, say Schakowsky. No, it is a result of people not taking responsibility for their own lives. The Illinois lawmaker acknowledges that her party deserves some of the blame. In 1999, many Democrats voted for the repeal of Glass-Steagall Act, separating commercial and investment banks, which most economists say contributed to the 2008 meltdown. Schakowsky did not vote for the repeal, but she says Republicans are largely responsible for the widening income gap, pointing to a policy-based attack on organized labor and other initiatives. I gotta love the wonderful world of partisan politics. I would say that much more of this has to be laid at the feet of the Republicans, she said. Surely the way out is being blockaded by the Republicans. I don't know that there's any economist right now that would say it's more important to reduce the debt and deficit than to spend and create jobs to stimulate the economy. It's just wrong. Admittedly, there are certainly corrupt and irresponsible people in high places. History repeatedly shows that. However, the trouble with letting George do it is that George never has other people's interests in mind, and if he did, then he would be irresponsible. Schakowsky introduced a bill earlier this year to increase marginal tax rates for those making more than $1 million to 45%, with the marginal rate going up to 49% for income over $1 billion. We need tax fairness in this country, and the Republicans right now are on a crusade against low-income people, she said. Fairness is a non-word. It does not exist in the world. Conservatives reject this formulation. Kevin A. Hassett, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, says that the focus should be poverty, not inequality. He calls it immoral and unethical for Democrats to push a spread the wealth philosophy. Hassett points out to Democratic efforts to increase the marginal tax rate in individuals, a position some Republicans have deemed class warfare. More class warfare applications. What part of the class war is imaginary does not anyone understand. When you put a high top rate in it, it will cause economic damage, and that income damage will tend to impact people on the bottom end of the income distribution because they're the most vulnerable, he said. In pushing for an increase in taxes on the high earners, he said, Democrats are making a calculated appeal to the median voters' greed and are putting politics ahead of social justice. Of course, social justice does not consider responsible and individualistic people. Douglas Holtz-Aiken, the former director of the Congressional Budget Office and Chief Economic Policy to John McCain's 2008 presidential bid, argues that globalization, not congressional policy, has been the key force in exacerbating the wealth and income gaps. When the labor became flat in the 1990s, he said the economic value of Americans near the bottom of the economic ladder decreased. If you bring in the billions in new low-skilled laborers into the world economy, the value of low-skilled workers go down. I don't think there's anything about a tax policy that's going to undo that. It's a global force. Holtz-Aiken argues that instead of economically damaging redistribution policies, Congress should be focused on improving education so that low-skilled workers have financial capital. Yes, give them loans to go to universities. Wow, people that are willing to work for their free lunch. The universe is about to crush. There is, of course, a hint of racism. You can figure it out yourself. Now, continuing. In their 2010 book, Winner Take All Politics, political scientists Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson examine the structural methods through which Washington produces policy that benefits high-income Americans. The key they found was the organized pressure put on lawmakers, which include lobbying campaigns, ginned-up grassroots movements, and implicit or explicit threats to support rivals. Yes, Occupy Wall Street is a ginned-up movement, so what's your point? Alienated nation. Americans complain of government discontent. Congress is really often responding to organized pressure, Pearson says. So organization matters enormously, and that has an implication for inequality because businesses and the affluent tend to be a lot more organized than anyone else. Organized pressure is one reason the government is legally prohibited from bargaining with the pharmaceutical industry over drug prices despite being the largest purchaser of its products. Such pressure also helps to explain why the Defense Department budget has spiraled from $51 billion in 1963 to more than $700 billion today. Take this as a lesson. Do not make promises one cannot keep. Corporations and Congress, a love affair. Former New York Democratic Representative John Hall, who lost his seat in the 2010 midterm election, said the pressure on lawmakers to court affluent interest and craft policy that'll make him happy is intense. Well, I guess the average number of the House spends at least 30% of their time doing fundraising. It starts right after the election. He says lawmakers are constantly cultivating lobbyists and other people who have a lot of money in order to get reelected, arguing the process just skews the democracy from one man to one vote to $1, one vote, voting with debt. Who said that slavery is abolished? The situation came under some scrutiny in 2008 when lawmakers' sanctioning of a deregulated financial system resulted in a worldwide economic breakdown and a recession as endured to this day. Anger over the event of bailouts that followed gave rise to the Tea Party movement, which ostensibly reflected voter anger at a political system corrupted by influence. In case you were not paying attention, the Tea Party movement was another AstroTurf movement funded by the Hunt, Coors, Koch, and Grace families. And I know many of the elite of the patriarchs of the Coors and Grace family are Knights of Malta as well, but moving on. But according to Pearson, all voter anger has done is to empower people who are doing everything they can to make inequality worse. The Republican candidates for president, most of whom claim Tea Party allegiance, are now calling for increased taxes on the poor and reduced taxes on the rich. They want to repeal the Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform bill meant to provide some protection to consumers from the excesses of a deregulated financial industry. It should be noted that conservatives like Hassett would argue that these actions actually help the poor by reducing the tax burden on job creators and eliminating regulations can hamper productivity. What has empowering people ever accomplished? Nothing. Mitt Romney, one of the front runners for the GOP nomination, unveils a job creation plan Tuesday that eliminates capital gains tax on many taxpayers and opposes union interests. His chief rival, longtime Texas Governor Rick Perry, touts his economic record while presiding over a state with the fourth highest poverty rate and the highest percentage of minimum wage jobs in the nation. And Rick Perry apparently attended a Bilderberg meeting a couple of years ago, but moving on. Last January, the Supreme Court eliminated restrictions on the right of corporations to spend unlimited amounts on politics, making it easier for wealthy organizations and individuals to apply pressure to lawmakers. I'll be back in a second. Okay, where was I? The 2012 election cycle has seen the rise of so-called super PACs, massive political action committees raising tens of millions of dollars to help candidates win elections. Meanwhile, outside groups like Crossroad GPS serve as a conduit for anonymous donors to pour further millions into the political system. Each election cycle and their influence can often decide which candidate makes it to Washington. Tchaikovsky says the influx of hundreds of millions of dollars in the political system explains why Americans cast ballots for lawmakers who back policies that widen the income gap. Yes, why do people still vote? This just makes me wonder. But moving on. The electoral environment is very skewed right now to the wealthiest Americans, she says. Yes, and she probably takes money from political action committees as well, but I digress. Pearson argues that since it's effectively impossible to get money out of politics, the best hope for the middle and lower classes is to organize and exert pressure that counterbalances and influences the wealthy. Some of such groups like the AARP already exist, and organized labor has long been a major force in politics. Yes, and they're kissing cousins of big business as well. Though the labor movement has suffered a decades-long decline in membership and influence. Asked if the wealth gap could get wide enough to spur more Americans to organize to counterbalance the influence of those at the top of the ladder, Pearson was pessimistic. I'd like to say that, he said, but there's none in the experience of the last couple of decades that makes me confident that when people get frustrated, they'll produce the kind of politics that are going to reverse things. One of the joys of living in a pluralistic society is that the rule of law is disregarded if it conflicts with any vested interests. Deal with it, and I'm out of here. See you next time.